Great bill. Thank you very much.
Call Dennis O'Rourke.
Mr Speaker, this bill is simply objectionable, and in some parts it is draconian in two fundamental ways. First, by adopting the policy of reviewable rentals based solely on the assessed ability of tenants to move into private accommodation, either rental or home ownership. When in the main population centres, especially Auckland and Christchurch, the cost of homes has exploded and the rents for rental properties, if they can be found, has rocketed out of control. And the second way is by reducing the role and nature of Housing New Zealand and pushing rental housing responsibility onto community organisations, some of which are clearly not capable of fulfilling that role. And not only are there very extensive powers of investigation of any tenant to see if they are eligible for income-related housing, but several new clauses set up Housing New Zealand effectively as New Zealand's housing police and authorise Housing New Zealand to set aside the Privacy Act. Housing New Zealand may, in this bill, by written notice, require information from any person concerning housing assessment reviews, the only exceptions being in cases of genuine privilege and financial information such as financial transactions. But that still leaves a lot of information which any person must provide so that anyone can give most information they have about a Housing New Zealand tenant as though they are second-class citizens in that respect, without fear of infringing important human rights as set out in the Privacy Act. And, Mr Speaker, this is typical of the government's attitude to Housing New Zealand tenants, second-class citizens. And the offences are draconian. They provide for imprisonment for up to 12 months or a fine not exceeding $5,000 or both. The only redeeming provisions in this draconian part of the bill and Act are those relating to the Code of Conduct and to the role of the Privacy Commissioner. But these do not alter the fact that human rights are trampled by this bill. The government's whole approach is wrong, and the bill will have to be repealed when possible because it attacks some of the most vulnerable people in the community. Those who cannot afford to buy a home in today's market, or who cannot afford the spiralling rents in the private rental market, especially, of course, in Auckland and in Christchurch. The basic problem is that people who are assessed as capable of obtaining private sector accommodation are not, in many cases, able to either find alternative rental properties or, in fact, pay exorbitant rents in Christchurch or Auckland especially. And, Mr Speaker, I know from my personal experience in talking with people and seeing people who come to me in Christchurch that it is difficult to obtain alternative accommodation in Christchurch and that the rents are exorbitant and these people would have a real problem. And National still has the gall to stand a candidate in the Christchurch East by-election, while this obnoxious bill proceeds to enactment on a slender majority. Christchurch East will be the worst affected electorate in this country by this thoughtless bill. And if the effects of the Canterbury earthquakes are not enough, this bill will be another blow for the many Housing New Zealand tenants in Christchurch and in Christchurch East in particular who are struggling to recover. The government seeks to suppress demand rather than to provide more rental housing by moving people out of state houses if Housing New Zealand assesses that they are financially able to do so. This is not by itself a satisfactory reason, and there is no adequate reason in principle or policy for that to be the only or main criteria for a policy which will force people to move. And despite the government's claims that it would have a lenient approach, People will inevitably be nudged out of their homes, effectively bullied out of their homes, because the government is unwilling to build more homes, and that is the real issue. This government is in fact unwilling to meet the demand, and instead will artificially suppress demand rather than meeting the housing needs of people who need it. There are good reasons for people, especially the elderly, to choose to remain in state house rentals, even if they are assessed as being able to move elsewhere, when it is not necessarily the best option for them. The constant threat of regular reviews will lead to significant social problems. Health, education and personal security will suffer, and community well-being will suffer. All this stress, especially for elderly and other vulnerable people, cannot be done in the lenient way asserted by this government. What is needed is a genuine social housing service, not just buildings, but a service to customers who will pay market rents when they can afford them, or income-related rents when they cannot. And those needs will be matched with the housing best suited to them, not just shunted out of the state system into the hands of others who may or may not be best suited for the purpose. The government will transfer large sums of money to community housing organisations through subsidies to registered providers. These organisations will own the housing funded or gifted by the government, and there will be no state asset in return. The provisions in this bill to deal with incompetent providers and with those which fail altogether are confused and inadequate, not nearly good enough to justify the application of such huge amounts of public money. The most glaring omission is that the bill does not provide for local councils to be community providers at all. Despite the Christchurch City Council, where I live, being the second largest provider after Housing New Zealand, and despite other councils such as Wellington and Auckland and others having a long, well-proven record of excellence in social housing provision, the government should actually be funding such councils with long-term, low-interest loans, and that's New Zealand First policy, so that they can provide elderly persons housing and public rental housing, and also provide the many support services needed by a genuine housing service provider. And as I've said, that is what is really needed here. And they can coordinate this with other council plans and services, things this government simply doesn't understand. And this misguided bill actually proves that without any doubt. It's a bill, Mr. Speaker, with many risks. Economic risks for the government, social risks for our housing-stressed communities, and major risks for the health and well-being of thousands of Kiwis who are most at risk from a don't-care attitude of an incompetent government. This bill should not be enacted for all of those reasons. It is quite simply misconceived. It doesn't build on the experience of the past. It sails out into an uncertain future with many risks, far too many risks, for this bill to be viable. Mr. Speaker, this is an obnoxious bill. It is a bad piece of legislation, and it should simply not be enacted.
The Honourable Phil Heatley.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to stand to congratulate the Minister, Nick Smith, for introducing